Hey everybody! In this video I'm going to be showing you how you can use white and black charcoal pencils with a Q-tip to create a hair texture with highlights and shadows. So really quick, before you get started, it's really important to erase any guidelines that you might have had on your drawing. So any like grid lines or anything like that, you want to make sure that those are all gone before you start your charcoal because it'll be really hard to erase it after you've already done your shadows and highlights. So I've got my reference picture right here, and then I already did like a sample for you over here so you can kind of see where we're going with this. And then on this side is my actual outlines that I'm working with. So what you're going to need for today is a white charcoal pencil, a black, and a Q-tip. These do not have to be the sharpest pencils in the entire world. It's very hard to get a charcoal pencil to be really, really sharp, so don't worry if they're not super sharp. And I have one end that's like kind of broken, and that actually works really well for getting hard to reach areas. So first thing that we've got to do is look for where our highlights are. I like to start by doing the highlights first and then doing the darker areas afterward, because I find that it's just easier to lay down all of the white areas and then do the black over top. So look at your person's hair and think about where those highlights are. So Audrey Hepburn here has got a lot of light shining on this side, and there's a little bit of a halo of light over here as well, although it's not quite as bright. So I am going to actually eventually tone down this area over here so it's not so intense. And the other important thing to know as you are shading and highlighting with your pencil is to always flow in the direction of the hair. You don't want to be cross-hatching, you don't want to be stippling, you want to actually use the pencil and pretend that you're doing the individual strokes of hair. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And really, as a teacher, I work best by just doing and you watching rather than me sort of talking through it, but I will talk to you as I am doing this about what I'm doing. So right now I am working on this little area. It doesn't really matter exactly where you start, although I will say as I'm doing this that I like to start with the hair on my person because it's usually the highest thing in the picture. Imagine if we had shaded all of this down here and then tried to work on the hair. Your hand would be rubbing all over all of your hard work and it would be smearing it. So I like to work on my drawings from top to bottom, and it's usually better to work from left to right. But this is a very small picture, so I'm not super worried about working from left to right here, but it might be good for you to work from left to right as well. But if you're left-handed, it's better to work from right to left. Whatever is going to help keep your hands, the side of your hand, out of your work. So again, I'm flowing with the direction of the hair. I'm just sort of looking at where these highlights are, what they're doing. And you might realize as you're doing this, like once you start to put your darker pencil on, that maybe you need a little bit more highlight than you originally had. It's not a terrible thing if you put a little bit too much highlight on because you can just cover it back up. However, in general, you want to try to avoid mixing the black and white pencil on top of each other. It's going to give you a weird gray that's different from the gray of your paper. Remember, your paper is already gray. So any like midtones or anything like that, the paper has already provided for you. All you're really adding are the lightest lights and the darkest darks. So I'm just looking for those really bright areas here. She's got a lot of like really intense light on the end of this curl right here, so I'm going to try to recreate that again, moving with the curve of the hair pattern. Notice that there's a lot of light in this spot right here, so I'm going to try to recreate that. And another tip, I mentioned this to you guys before, but if you squint your eyes and look at your reference photo, it can become a little bit easier to just focus on the lights and the darks, and you don't see as much of like the little details. It makes it a little bit easier to not get lost in those little details that we don't really need to worry about right now. looking at this highlight right here, including that. There's a soft highlight over here. And if you want something to be really bright, you can go over it a couple of times. You can press with decent pressure. I wouldn't press too hard or else you might run the risk of breaking your pencil. Okay. And I think that's pretty good for the light areas right now. And just to kind of compare that to the original drawing I did, that's what it looks like. Okay, so now we can, if you'd like, this is sort of optional at this point, but you can take one end of your Q-tip. It's good to designate one end as the dark end and one end as the light end. So I actually started to already use dark on this side, so I'm going to use light on this side. You can use your fingers to blend. However, I find that when you're working in a small area or when you're working in like hair strands and things like that, I actually prefer to use a Q-tip because I just find that it gives me a little bit more control. And you don't want to blend this to the point where you're losing all of your little individual lines and pencil strokes. Just soften a little bit. So now we can go in with our dark. And what I like to do is start very light pressure. I don't want to go too heavy too fast. And we can start to look for some areas of darkness. So on this reference picture right here, if we zoom in a little bit, let's say, for example, like this little chunk of hair right here. It's very light on the end here. It's sort of a medium gray right here, and then it's dark right here. So remember, we don't want to kill all of the gray of the paper. We want that to show through just a little bit. So I'm going to actually start on that chunk I just mentioned. I'm going to go from the root. I always like to start at like the scalp area, like where the hair is just growing out. I'm going to do a few pencil strokes. I'm not like going back and forth and like scrubbing the paper with the pencil. Remember, we're still moving the pencil as if we were creating the strands of hair. And then I'm going to take the dark side of my Q-tip and again flow with the hair pattern. Don't just scrub the paper. Just like so. And then if we feel like we need a little bit more texture, add a little bit more. Sometimes I blend, sometimes I don't blend. If I want the pencil to show a little bit more, especially when you're doing the hair, you want that hair pattern, like that strand effect to show through. So let's move on to this chunk right here. I'm bringing it a little bit into the white pencil to create a nice even gradient between the lights and the darks. You definitely don't want to like have a big chunk of white and then a big chunk of black like right next to each other. Like you want it to have a nice gradual change in between. So that's just to give you some background on what I'm doing here. And when I'm blending here, I like to work on one chunk at a time. So I did that chunk first, and now I'm going in and doing this chunk of hair. I just find that I like to kind of complete one lock of hair at a time, like blending, shading, highlighting. I like to get one done first and then move on to another section. So now I'm going to work on this little bit right up here. Now, you might be somebody who wants to do all of the lights and the darks first and then blend. However, I will advocate for doing a chunk at a time because I find that if you've got all these lights and all of these darks, you might actually lose the chunks of hair. Like it might become a little bit blurry to you about which is which. So I find that I like to just sort of define one section or maybe one or two sections at a time. So here's how we're doing so far. I'm going to move on over here. Now I'm noticing like there's a really dark little crevice right in there in the hair. There's like a really deep part. So I'm going to go ahead and block that in. But then everything else around it is a little bit softer, so I'm not going to press as hard. Okay. And then I'm going to move on to down here just to jump ahead so that we're not taking too long for this demo. This is a very dark area of her hair in here, but I'm still not like just completely filling it in solid black. I want it to be a soft dark gray. And this is where I'm actually going to use the broken end of my pencil. I'm going to come back over here, work around this little bit of highlight. So this is really the entire process. Like you're just moving in the direction that the hair is growing in, imagining that your pencil is creating each little strand of hair, blending it into each other. I'm going to work on this area of her bangs for a little bit just to show you how you might go about doing this with longer hair. It's really the same process. You're just working in these longer strokes. And again, this area of her hair, these highlights are not as intense, like they're very soft. So like they're definitely not as bright as this area over here. So here's where I'm actually going to go over the white just a little bit with the black pencil, not completely covering it up, but just enough to where the light is just peeking through a tiny bit. And then I'll take my pencil, or my Q-tip rather, and I'm gonna blend over that entire area. See, over here, I blended the light first, and then I added the dark and blended just the dark areas. Now I'm gonna pull the Q-tip over both the light and the dark areas. And then you can sort of redefine the edges of the hair if needed. And I'm working in these little kind of curving motions to recreate the hair texture. And then you can blend again, and sometimes you might get to a point where you're like, okay, if I blend too much, it's gonna get too blurry, so you just do it just very gently. And then, aside from that, that pretty much is your entire process. And just to let you know, if you realize that you accidentally made something like a little bit too dark, you can take the white pencil and go back over. However, try to avoid doing that because it tends to make the highlight look like oddly grayish blue when it's mixed with the black charcoal. And it just might not look very like neat or cohesive. So again, like try to do the light areas first of the hair, the highlight areas first. Try to get all of those dropped in before you start to go in with the black. And then take your black, wherever you have a really bright highlight, don't cover up those white areas. You want to try to work around them. Blend very gently with your Q-tip. And then if there's an area that needs to be especially dark, you can go back over a little bit heavier with your pencil. So that's pretty much the whole process for doing the hair with charcoal. And then upcoming, we'll have some demo videos on skin and clothing. Thanks for watching.